go. I will commit every rut of this wagon wheel to memory. Next time, it will be I who sees you off. The bitter winter wind bit fiercely, piercing through her thin linen gown. A dark, foul-smelling salve had been smeared over her legs by Giles, the apothecary, and covered with a rough cloth bearing a heavy red wax seal. Along with the pungent stench of the herbs, her legs were turning stiff, as if turning to solid stone. Elise pinched her own thigh, but instead of pain, only a chilling terror crept up her spine. Beyond the heavy oak door, the shadow of Maud, her cruel mother-in-law, loomed large and flickering in the candlelight. This was no illness. It was a deliberate, wicked trap. Injustice piles up in the silence, but the power to bring the truth to light comes from an unbreakable will. She silently swore that she would bear witness to her own tragedy, and that the heavens themselves would eventually stand by her side. From the crack of dawn, distant relatives, who usually wandered from tavern to manor, crossed the threshold of the bedchamber. Maud roughly pulled back Elise's woolen blanket, displaying her daughter-in-law as if she were a hunted beast hung up for show. Her 2 legs, dreadfully thin and pale as a corpse, were exposed to the world like a grotesque spectacle. Elise trembled like a trapped mouse on her straw mattress, but her legs remained entirely motionless, as though heavy iron anvils were chained to her ankles. The sound of clicking tongues echoed from every corner of the room. Cruel words, sharper than daggers, pierced Elise's chest, leaving invisible, burning brands. They whispered that she was cursed, a barren blight upon the manor who could not produce an heir. Standing near the head of the bed, Maud sneered. With a swift kick of her leather shoe, Maud overturned the wooden bowl of watery vegetable pottage resting on the floor. Watching the thin broth spill across the stone floor, Elise bit her own lip so hard that warm blood pooled in her mouth. In the dead of night, when the entire manor was asleep, the heavy door creaked open, and Giles stepped inside. Believing Elise was in a deep slumber, the corrupt apothecary began to unwrap the bandages, muttering low under his breath. "The effects of the potion will wear off by dawn," he whispered to himself. "I must keep applying another layer." In the pitch black, Elise's eyes snapped open. This was no permanent paralysis. These monsters were purposely using a paralyzing poison to turn a perfectly healthy woman into a crippled invalid. A violent shudder ran down her spine. That brief window of time before dawn was her only opening. Elise clenched her fists tightly. If she wanted to survive and claim her vengeance, she had to deceive them completely. If they wanted a beast, she would become a beast. If they wanted a corpse, she would become a corpse. As the pale light of dawn broke, sensation miraculously returned to her legs. A sharp, tingling prickle spread through her toes as the blood began to flow again. She wanted to kick off the blankets and leap to her feet right then and there, but the cold, heavy footsteps of Maud echoed from the corridor. The door swung open, and Maud entered. In her hand, she held a thick iron sewing needle, its sharp point glinting with a wicked menace. Without a word of warning, Maud drove the needle deep into the soft flesh of Elise's soul. An agonizing pain, like tearing flesh, struck Elise's brain. She screamed a blood-curdling scream on the inside, But on the outside, she did not twitch a single muscle. Holding her breath, she stared blankly into the empty air with dead, unfocused eyes. When the iron needle was pulled out, drops of dark red blood welled up and dripped down onto the straw mattress. It was as if Elise were weeping tears of blood. "Look at this," Maud scoffed, a wicked, metallic smile twisting her lips. "She has become a walking corpse that feels nothing even when pierced with a needle. What on earth are we to do with her?" Satisfied that her cruel test was passed, Maud left the room to set the next stage of her horrific plan into motion. Only then did Elise let out the breath she had been holding. Cold sweat poured down her face like rain. If her act were to be discovered, she would lose her life on the spot. Later that day, the heavy iron gates of the manor were thrown wide open, and the bitter wind carried the curious, prying eyes of the village into the muddy courtyard. Maud had summoned the local peasant women, loudly boasting about how hideous and foul her daughter-in-law's affliction had become. 2 burly manor guards, led by the ruthless Wolf, grabbed Elise by her arms and legs. They carried her like a sack of grain and tossed her carelessly onto an old, splintered wooden cart in the corner of the courtyard. Her hair fell loosely into the mud and dust. Her linen gown was disheveled, but Elise did not move a single finger. Neighbors passing by the stone walls stopped to point and stare. Whispers flew like poisoned arrows, accusing her of being a cursed woman who brought a demon's blight to the manor master's household. Hot tears of profound humiliation rolled down her ears and into her hair, but she had to keep her eyes shut and hold her breath like a dead woman. Maud paced back and forth in front of Elise for all to see, letting out a cold, mocking laugh. "I cannot keep my perfectly healthy son tied to a rotting wife," Maud announced loudly. "I must bring a new bride into the house." Just then, a servant carrying a heavy iron pot of boiling meat broth tripped over a loose cobblestone. The scalding liquid splashed directly onto Elise's bare foot. The horrific agony of her flesh burning red struck her mind like a thunderbolt. Her body screamed to thrash about, to wail in torment, but Elise bit down on the inside of her cheek, swallowing the blood, and suppressed even the most basic reflex to flinch. Her terrifying endurance was so absolute that even the gossiping onlookers turned their heads away, their faces pale with shock. When the pity of the crowd turns to disgust and horror, there is no one left to save you. In the dead of night, when all was silent, only the sound of rats scurrying in the corners of the manor broke the stillness. Elise finally slipped her hands under the rough blanket and frantically massaged her stiffening legs. To keep her muscles from withering away to nothing, she had to endure the agony every night, pinching her own flesh in the dark. When the sun rose, Maud dragged Elise's most treasured, costly velvet gown out into the courtyard. With a pair of heavy iron shears, she mercilessly snipped and slashed the beautiful fabric. The butchered gown was thrown right over Elise's face like a dirty rag. The shredded fabric was just like her torn and battered pride. "You are not dead yet, Elise," Maud spat viciously. "I will wait until your sins rot you away completely." The door to the chamber burst open violently. Maud stormed in, accompanied by Wolf and the other menacing manor guards. Maud shoved a dense piece of parchment, covered in heavy black ink, right under Elise's nose. It was a formal writ of annulment and banishment, stating that Elise was cursed with an incurable wicked disease, that she could not bear an heir, and that she was stepping down of her own free will. As Elise instinctively tried to hide her hands behind her back, the towering wolf lunged forward, grabbing her arm and twisting it back with brutal force. Cold sweat broke out at the agonizing pain of her bones nearly popping from their sockets, but Elise bit her lip and endured it. Maud snatched Elise's hand, forcing her fingers open to reveal her silver signet ring. Before Elise could resist, her hand was brutally twisted, and the ring was forcefully crushed down into a pool of hot red wax upon the parchment. The crimson seal hardened over the page, looking exactly like Elise's trampled life. With the document sealed, Maud grabbed Elise by the hair, shaking her head mockingly. "With this single piece of parchment, you are no longer a part of this house. You are not even fit to be a ghost in our halls." Even through the pain, Elise's eyes gleamed fiercely. From the corner of her eye, she perfectly memorized the red wax seal of the manor stamped at the bottom of the writ. "Heaven and earth know that I did not stamp this by my own hand," she vowed silently. No sooner had the thought crossed her mind than Wolf and the guards hoisted her up like a piece of garbage. She was dragged out of the manor hall and violently thrown onto the dirt floor of the damp, moldy granary. The heavy wooden door slammed shut, and the sound of the iron bolt sliding into place echoed coldly, like the gates of a dungeon sealing her fate. Pitch black darkness consumed her. Elise trembled with rage as she frantically rubbed her wax-burned hand against her torn skirt. Legally, she was now a complete stranger to the family, placed in a position where she could be tossed out to die without a single soul knowing or caring. But instead of despair, a venomous resolve filled her heart. That forcefully stamped wax seal was their justification to cast her out. But one day, it would serve as the most undeniable proof of the manor's cruel coercion. The granary reeked of rotting mold and rat urine. A bone-chilling cold rose from the damp earth, freezing her entirely. Elise fumbled through the darkness and found scattered raw oats on the dirt floor. She tossed the dirt-covered grains into her mouth and chewed them fiercely. Every time the hard grain cracked between her teeth, a bitter taste of soil filled her mouth. Her throat burned dry and rough, but she had to swallow even this to stay alive. With a loud creak, the door opened, and a sliver of light poured in. Giles, the corrupt apothecary sent by Maud under the cover of darkness, shoved a wooden bowl of thin, watery broth inside, treating her no better than a dog. Giles then peeled the hardened black salve from Elise's legs and slapped on a fresh, thick layer. The pungent stench of the poison stung her nose. Elise did not miss the brief moment Giles looked away. With trembling hands, she snatched the piece of parchment that had wrapped the apothecary's supplies. On the crumpled corner of the paper was the unmistakable red wax seal of Giles, the man who dealt in poisonous herbs. This was the irrefutable, damning evidence that Maud had used poison. As soon as the apothecary left, Elise shoved the cloth and paper deep into her bodice, pressing it against her chest. Her heart pounded so violently, it felt like it would break her ribs. If she were caught, she would be killed immediately. This single piece of evidence was her only weapon to prove that Maud had turned a perfectly healthy woman into a cripple. Pitch-black darkness settled over her once more. Relying on the faint moonlight seeping through the cracks in the wooden planks, Elise raised her body. She bent and straightened her stiffening legs hundreds of times. Her joints popped and screamed in agony, but she could not stop. If her muscles froze here, she would never be able to enact her revenge. Cold sweat poured down her spine. Just then, the crunch of footsteps echoed outside the door. Elise hurriedly let her body go limp, throwing herself to the floor and rolling her eyes back as if she were dead. Through a crack in the door, someone's eyes glinted in the dark, peering inside. Elise held her breath, remaining as motionless as a corpse. Thanks to the heavy darkness, her slight trembling went unnoticed. A clicking tongue sounded from outside. How many more days will she last? Clearing out her corpse is going to be a chore. As the footsteps faded away, Elise let out the breath she had been holding. She reached into her pocket and gripped a sharp shard of a broken iron hairpin. She had secretly picked it up when Maud threw it out in the courtyard and had spent hours grinding it against a stone to make it razor sharp. The pointed end pierced her palm and warm blood seeped out, but she felt no pain. Carried by the winter wind, the faint sound of her husband Rowan coughing reached her ears. The sound was weaker and more hollow than it had been days ago. Rowan was bedridden and completely unaware of his mother's wicked plot. If his breathing stopped, Elise would be disposed of like garbage in the night. Anxiety flared up like a roaring fire. Elise grabbed the bowl of freezing broth and drank it down in one gulp. The injustice and fury churned hotly in her stomach. She glared at the heavy door with eyes that gleamed in the dark. I will not die. Not until I walk out of here on my own 2 feet and sever your heads from your shoulders. The granary was as silent and cold as a tomb. The freezing chill from the earth gnawed at her bones. Elise crouched in the darkness, holding her breath like a dead woman. Only the sound of rats scratching at the grain sacks filled the silence. Then it happened. Click. A small pebble rolled in through a gap in the stone foundation. It was a promised signal. Elise silently pressed her body to the floor and slithered toward the wall like a serpent. Through the crack in the mud and stone, the comforting, savory smell of warm food wafted in. A hand reached through the narrow gap, pushing 2 warm, baked turnips inside. The warmth that touched her cold hands was so comforting that her eyes instantly welled with tears. It was Bess, the kind peasant neighbor who had always pitied Elise for the abuse she suffered at Maud's hands. "Are you still alive in there?" Bess whispered. "Late last night, I saw that wretched apothecary Giles sneaking in through the back gate." At Bess's whispered words, Elise's hands began to tremble violently. It was the moment her suspicions hardened into absolute certainty. Every night, Maud was having Giles sneak in to maintain the theatrical ruse, destroying Elise's body in secret. Elise shoved a piece of the turnip into her mouth and chewed frantically. Her throat was painfully dry, but she forced the food down without a single drop of water. She had to live. She had to gather her strength. With sudden resolve, Elise placed her hands against the cold stone wall and slowly pushed herself up. Bess, peering through the crack, gasped sharply and sucked in a breath. The woman they said was a crippled invalid was standing tall on her own 2 feet. As Bess opened her mouth to cry out in shock, Elise quickly brought a finger to her own lips. With her eyes alone, she desperately pleaded for secrecy. "Lord, have mercy! Your legs!" Bess's voice trembled thinly. "Do not worry. My lips are sealed heavier than a stone grave." Reading the frost-like, venomous determination and absolute resolve in Elise's eyes, Bess spoke with solemn gravity. Bess nodded. Elise now had an ally worth an army. While Bess kept watch, Elise began her grueling rehabilitation. Her legs, having lain motionless for days, trembled like a newborn fawn's. The moment she took a single step, her knees buckled and she collapsed hard onto the stone floor. The rough stone scraped her skin, drawing blood, but she felt no pain. Elise gritted her teeth and pushed her hands against the damp wall. Cold sweat poured down her face, soaking her thin linen shift. One step, then another. Pacing the cramped, freezing granary in circles, she forced her stiffened muscles to wake. Her thighs burned as though they might burst, and her lungs gasped for air. Yet she could not stop. This physical agony was nothing compared to the crushing humiliation Maud had inflicted upon her soul. From that day on, Bess became Elise's eyes and ears.
Under the cover of night, the peasant woman smuggled in roasted root vegetables and barley bread, whispering the dark tidings of the manor through the crack in the wall.
The news was devastating. Maud was planning a grand winter feast for the entire village to announce a new bride for Rowan. A cold, hollow smile touched Elise's lips. That feast would be their day of reckoning. Elise reached through the crack and tightly gripped Bess's calloused hand. "When the time comes, speak one word of truth for me. That is all I ask." Bess made a solemn vow and vanished into the dark shadows of the estate. Left alone in the freezing granary, Elise clenched her fists. She had secured a witness, and the strength was slowly returning to her legs. But every passing hour was like walking on a frozen pond. If Bess were to betray her, or if Maud caught wind of the deception, all her suffering would be for nothing. In the pitch-black room, Elise's eyes gleamed with the sharp, terrifying clarity of a hunted beast. It was a night swallowed by a blinding blizzard. Muffled voices echoed outside the walls. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door of the granary burst open with a deafening crash, letting in a violent swirl of snow and biting wind. Elise instinctively began to curl into a ball to protect herself from the cold. But she froze. From this moment on, she had to be a corpse. Wolf and another burly manor guard stomped into the room. They grabbed Elise's arms and legs with brutal force, manhandling her like a slaughtered calf. Her wrists were seized so violently, she thought the bones would snap. She wanted nothing more than to scream and fight back. Instead, Elise let her body go entirely limp, a lifeless slab of meat in their hands. If she tensed her muscles or showed any resistance now, the agonizing nights of rehabilitation
would be ruined. Rolling her eyes back and holding her breath, she allowed the guards to drag her through the dirt. The manor courtyard was already buried in white. In the center sat a battered wooden cart, resembling a cage for wild beasts. Standing under the eaves was Maud, wrapped in a thick wool and fur cloak, her arms crossed. Her eyes were colder and more piercing than the winter storm itself. One of the guards carried out Elise's belongings. It was her fine wool and linen wedding gown, sewn by her mother's own hands with tears of joy. With a cruel sneer, the guard threw the beautiful garment directly into a puddle of freezing mud in the corner of the yard. Filthy slush splashed over the fabric, staining it black. It was a vile mockery of Elise's trampled life, a silent curse ensuring she would never return to this house. The guards hoisted Elise up like a sack of grain and tossed her onto the cart. A sickening thud echoed as her spine slammed against the hard wooden floorboards. A gasp of pain rose in her throat, but Elise bit down on her tongue, forcing herself to remain perfectly still. Thick hemp ropes were then thrown over her, binding her tightly to the cart. The crushing pressure around her chest made her dizzy. Maud slowly approached the cart. Reaching roughly into Elise's garments, she seized the silver betrothal ring Elise had brought with her on her wedding day. Maud twisted the ring off with such vicious force that Elise's frozen knuckles nearly snapped. "Cannot waste good silver on a corpse. I shall use this as a gift for the new bride." Maud looked down at Elise's pale, motionless face and sneered with chilling malice. "With this much snow, the corpse will not rot until spring. Go." The sharp crack of the driver's whip split the night air. The old horse let out a strained breath and pulled. The cart lurched forward. The grinding of the wooden wheels against the frozen, rocky earth sounded like bones being crushed, echoing ominously through the dark. The cart passed the village outskirts and began the steep ascent up the mountain road. The biting wind slashed through the gaps in the wooden planks, piercing Elise's thin garments. The cold was so absolute, it felt as though her flesh was being torn from her body. As her senses slowly went numb, Elise fought with every ounce of her will to keep her mind awake. Struggling up the incline, the cart struck a massive rock and jolted violently. Elise's bound body was thrown into the air and slammed back down. For a terrifying second, the cart teetered on the edge of the steep ravine. Hidden from the sight of Maud's men, Elise secretly flexed her bound hands, gripping the hemp ropes. She dug her fingernails so deeply into her palms that blood welled up. She had to play dead, but she could not allow herself to truly die. Every time the cart rocked, she maintained her lifeless facade while imperceptibly tensing her core to keep her balance. It was a desperate, agonizing struggle for survival. Through the howling wind, Wolf's voice drifted back from the front of the cart. "Is that the cliff the mistress spoke of?" "Aye. She said to make it look as though she wandered off and fell to avoid the sheriff's questions. Toss her deep, where the forest beasts will feast." Hearing the guard's words, Elise's heart plummeted. This was not mere abandonment. It was calculated murder. Terror and overwhelming sorrow surged within her, bringing hot tears to her eyes. She wanted to scream, to beg them to spare her life, to let her crawl away into the woods. But Elise bit her lip. She bit down so hard that warm blood trickled down her chin. If she made a single sound, Wolf would strangle her to death on the spot. Swallowing her blood, she swallowed her cries. I will walk back on my own 2 feet. I will survive. The cart ventured deeper into the desolate, unforgiving winter mountains, far from any human settlement. The pitch-black darkness opened its jaws like a colossal beast waiting to swallow her whole. The deep ruts left by the cartwheels in the snow seemed to be the very last trace she would ever leave in the world of the living. To be cast into these woods meant certain death by freezing or wolves. With the callousness of men dumping spoiled meat, Wolf and the guards grabbed Elise and heaved her roughly over the edge, sending her tumbling into a jagged, snow-filled ravine. The crack of the whip and the grinding of the cartwheels slowly faded into the dark. Elise lay perfectly still at the bottom of the ravine, holding her breath like a true corpse, until the falling snow piled thick upon her eyelashes and blinded her. When the silence of the mountain became as absolute as a grave, her eyes snapped open. Finding a sharp, jagged edge of stone, she pressed her bound wrists against it and began to saw frantically. The rough friction tore at the thick hemp, shredding the skin of her wrists until chunks of flesh were scraped away. But pain was a luxury she could not afford. Finally, the thick rope snapped. With her freed hands, she pushed against the freezing ground. Her lower back sent sharp jolts of warning, and her legs felt heavy and dead. But those agonizing nights in the granary, pacing until she coughed blood, had not been in vain. Her legs trembled violently, like a newborn calf's, yet she planted her bare feet in the snow and stood tall. Elise immediately reached into her shift, her trembling fingers searching for the parchment bearing Giles's red wax seal and the forced annulment writ. They were safe. Those papers were her lifeline, her blade of vengeance. Far below, through the dark, skeletal trees, a faint, flickering light appeared. Using that singular light as her beacon, she took a heavy step forward. The knee-deep snow dragged at her ankles like iron chains with every step. Her bare toes were already severely frostbitten, entirely numb and stiff as blocks of wood. Slipping on the steep, icy decline, she nearly tumbled off a sheer cliff. Elise blindly grabbed at dead roots jutting from the frozen earth, holding on for her life. Her fingernails tore back, and blood seeped from her palms, staining the pure white snow a horrific red. The freezing wind battered her mind until she was on the verge of losing consciousness. Just as her vision faded and she was about to collapse, the heavy oak door of an old stone chapel appeared before her like a divine miracle. Elise pounded on the thick wood with her frozen, bloodied fists. Claire, the old chapel abbess, opened the door and gasped in shock at the sight of the woman, pale and covered in frost, like a ghost of the winter woods. Without a single question or word of reprimand, Claire hurriedly grabbed Elise and pulled her into the warmth of the chapel room. A wooden bowl of steaming, bitter herbal broth was pressed into Elise's frozen hands. As the heat slowly spread through her veins, the towering rage and sorrow she had suppressed for so long rose bitterly in her throat. The living, are far more terrifying than any demon of the woods. Thaw your bones first, child.
Abbess, I have a debt of vengeance I must live to repay.
Claire simply shook her head in silence and draped a thick, heavy wool blanket over Elise's shivering shoulders. The moment Elise's back touched the stones warmed by the hearth fire, the tight string of tension that had kept her alive finally snapped.
Elise lost consciousness, falling into a deep, death-like sleep.
Even in her dreams, Maud's chilling, venomous laughter echoed in her ears. Elise woke with a muffled scream, drenched in cold sweat. Her eyes snapped open to see the bright morning sun streaming through the narrow chapel windows. Her hands were covered in scabs and torn flesh, and her feet were terribly swollen and blackened by the frost. But the heart beating in her chest was stronger and fiercer than ever before. Looking out the heavy wooden door, she saw the clear, bloody footprints of her bare feet trailing through the fresh snow. Had she not found the chapel, she would have frozen to death in the dark. Under the dim candlelight of the chapel's small back room, Elise's hands moved tirelessly. She had taken up a needle to earn her keep, but her embroidery was extraordinary. Through Claire's quiet word, her work reached Roland, a wealthy fabric merchant in the muddy market square. When Roland saw the exquisite stitching on the linen and wool, he was left entirely speechless. Working through the nights, bleeding her very soul into her craft, Elise earned the merchant's deep trust. Soon, Roland brought her news from the village that made her blood run cold. Under the guise of a memorial mass for Elise's tragic death in the snow, Maud was hosting a grand Christmas feast at the manor to formally announce Rowan's new bride. Furthermore, Alden, the regional earl and high magistrate, would be present at the high table to witness the betrothal and record the new dowry in the estate ledgers. Elise's fingertips trembled violently. This was God's own providence, a divine rope handed down from the heavens to hang the wicked. She immediately sent a discreet message through a trusted traveler to Bess. It was a desperate, blood-soaked plea. Be my witness tonight. Elise dropped to her knees before Roland and pulled back her heavy hood. Seeing the pale face of the woman the entire county believed to be dead, the merchant stumbled backward in sheer terror. But Elise bowed until her forehead bled against the floorboards, begging him to smuggle her into the manor feast disguised among his porters. On the night of the feast, the manor courtyard was ablaze with torches, bright as day. The rich smell of roasted meats and the loud, drunken laughter of the guests spilled over the stone walls. Elise, dressed in the ragged, coarse clothes of a lowly porter, kept her face hidden deep beneath a wool hood and followed closely behind Roland. As she crossed the manor gates, a familiar yet utterly sickening sight unfolded before her. At the high table sat Maud, draped in fine velvet, wearing a sickeningly benevolent smile as she accepted cups of ale and mead from the cheering guests. The sight of her murderer smiling, pretending to mourn while celebrating her grand victory, made Elise's eyes burn with a hellish fury. Feeling the forced annulment parchment and the cloth bearing Giles's red wax seal safely hidden inside her tunic, Elise stepped away from the merchants and walked directly toward the high table. Wolfe and the manor guards noticed the suspicious porter approaching and quickly moved to block her path.
As a rough scuffle broke out between the guards and the disguised woman, Maud turned her head in deep annoyance. The moment her gaze met the fierce, burning eyes glaring from beneath the shadow of the hood, Maud dropped her silver cup. Pale as a sheet, looking as though she had seen a demon rise from the grave, Maud shot to her feet and shrieked at the top of her lungs. "What foul wretch is this? Drag that beggar out of my sight at once." Wolf and the burly guards lunged forward, violently seizing Elise by the arms. She was hoisted into the air, mere seconds from being thrown out into the muddy road. But Elise let out a feral, agonizing wail and threw her dead weight to the floor, resisting with the fierce strength of a cornered beast, terrified only that the evidence hidden against her chest might be crushed. Desperately clutching her woolen bodice with one hand to protect the hidden evidence, Elise threw herself into the very center of the manor hall. The sudden chaos caused the feast to grind to a halt. The eyes of Lord Alden and all the gathered guests turned instantly to the muddy figure on the stone floor. Who is the starving beggar, and who is the true mistress of this estate, will be revealed this very day. Her fierce, frost-bitten voice sliced through the murmurs of the crowded hall, silencing the room in a single breath. If she were cast out now, she would be branded a madwoman and lose her only chance at justice. Through the tangled mess of her rain-soaked hair, Elise glared straight at Maud with eyes that burned like hot coals. While Roland used his own body to block Wolf and the other rough guards from advancing, Elise leaped into the open space before the high table and fell to her knees. Breathing heavily, she reached up and tore the linen hood from her head. A deathly stillness descended upon the manor hall. Maud turned as white as a bleached sheet. Whispers erupted among the guests that the dead woman had returned from the grave, and many shrank back as if they had seen a ghost. Trembling with sheer terror, Maud pointed a shaking finger at her and shrieked, "That is a demon from the woods! My son's wife died of a grievous illness. Drag that creature away!" At that exact moment, Elise pushed herself off the cold stone floor and stood upright. Planting her worn leather shoes firmly on the ground, she stood tall on her own 2 feet. The sight sent a shock wave through the hall. The charade of the paralyzed cripple was over. Reaching deep into her cloak, Elise pulled out the sealed parchment of her forced annulment and the apothecary's heavy paper bearing a distinct red wax seal. She slammed them down onto the wooden table directly in front of Lord Alden. "Are you so bitterly vexed that I did not freeze to death in the winter snow, Mother?" Elise's voice cut through the hall like a winter gale. "Here is the proof that you paralyzed a healthy woman with a foul potion and forced her signet ring onto a hot wax parchment to cast her away." Elise then pointed a trembling, scarred finger at Maud's hand. "And that silver heirloom ring upon your finger? Is that not the very ring you stripped from my hand by force before you left me in the deep forest to be devoured by wild beasts?" Maud hastily tried to pull her woolen sleeve over her hand, but the gleam of the silver ring in the candlelight had already caught the eyes of everyone in the room. The forcefully stamped signet seal on the parchment, the red wax seal of the potion, and the stolen ring were undeniable truths that no amount of wealth or noble standing could erase. From the back of the crowd, Bess pushed her way forward. "I saw it!" Bess cried out, pointing at the corrupt healer. I saw Giles sneaking into the manor that night to administer the foul draft. Caught in the sudden light of truth, Giles trembled like a leaf in a storm. Falling to his knees, he babbled his confession.
The potion turns the limbs to heavy stone, but leaves the mind fully awake. I swear it.
A wave of horror washed over the gathered townsfolk. Only then did they realize the true nightmare Elise had endured.
She had felt the boiling hot soup and the piercing pricks of the sewing needles, not because she was numb from an illness,
but because the cruel drug had trapped her inside her own body. Lord Alden carefully inspected the sealed parchment. He declared to the hall that the wax seal matched the apothecary's mark perfectly, and the hardened wax clearly showed a signet seal taken by brutal force. Sensing his impending doom, Giles tried to slip away toward the heavy oak doors, but Roland grabbed him firmly by the collar of his tunic. Thrown roughly to the stone floor, Giles turned pale as a corpse and groveled before Lord Alden. "I only did as the mistress commanded. I beg of you, spare my life." With all her wicked deeds laid bare beneath the light of day, Maud's legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the floor. The sympathy the guests had once shown her instantly morphed into glares of absolute disgust. Lord Alden looked down at Maud with a stern, unforgiving gaze. "The seal is genuine, and my eyes bear witness that this woman is no ghost." The 2 legs Elise stood upon were more powerful than any spoken defense. Had she lacked even a single piece of evidence, she might have been condemned as a witch or a false accuser. By early morning, the sheriff's courtyard was packed with commoners and nobles alike, swarming to see justice served. The villagers pointed and jeered at the pathetic state of the sinners. Forced to their knees before the wooden whipping post, Maud and Giles shook with terror. Lord Alden's voice thundered across the muddy market square. "Bear the weight of your sins for breaking the laws of God and casting a human soul to the beasts." The manor guards raised their heavy leather scourges high into the air and brought them down with brutal force. The dull thuds echoed across the courtyard. Maud let out a feral, agonizing wail. The dark stains that splattered the cobblestones were the price for the tears of blood Elise had shed in the freezing granary. Giles was stripped of his apothecary guild tokens, bound in heavy chains, and dragged away to the stone quarries for a lifetime of hard labor. Maud, stripped of her titles, was sentenced to life imprisonment in the dark dungeon of the very manor she once ruled. Oh, cursed fate! I must have been mad. Maud wept and begged for her life as she was bound to the wooden post. But Elise's expression remained as cold and unyielding as carved stone. She stared down at the completely ruined Maud with icy detachment, then turned her back without a single ounce of hesitation. Sympathy was a luxury she could no longer afford. As the wind caught the hem of Elise's linen gown, Bess and Roland rushed to her side, grasping her hands and weeping the tears that Elise herself could no longer shed. By the authority of the crown, Lord Alden forced open Maud's iron-bound chests, transferring the keys to the granary and the deeds of the manor fields into Elise's name. The extended family members of the Lord's estate, who had previously stood by, coughing awkwardly and doing nothing, now turned pale and stepped forward. They immediately recognized Elise as the rightful mistress of the house, bowing their heads to beg for her forgiveness. Elise took a massive portion of the newly acquired silver coins and sent them to the old monastery, offering a generous tithe to Abbess Clare, the savior of her life. It was the only way to repay the debt of her survival. The villagers gossiped that it was divine justice delivered by the heavens, praising Elise's fierce will to live. Yet, when the clamor died down and Elise returned to the grand, empty manor hall, her face held no triumphant joy. Instead, a bone-deep weariness and a bitter emptiness settled into her very soul. She sat by the hearth in her old chambers, running her fingers over the cold stone of the fireplace with a hollow smile. No one in this world would ever dare call her a cripple again. The revenge was complete, but the wounds she had suffered in the process would remain as permanent scars upon her heart. Spring breezes eventually swept through the manor courtyard that had been frozen all winter, and green shoots sprouted where the deep snow had melted. But the deep, jagged scars on Elise's wrists and the severe burn marks on her feet did not vanish with the arrival of spring. She rolled up her woolen sleeves, rubbing the reddened marks with absent-minded indifference. Her hands were mechanical and dry as she brewed herbal tea for Rowan. The blind, devoted sacrifice she once held for her sick husband was entirely gone. She ruled the manor estate with a chilling gaze. The servants, including Wolf, held their breath and pressed themselves against the walls at the mere sound of the mistress's footsteps. She never once turned her head toward the dark dungeon beneath the manor, where Maud was now imprisoned for life. It was not forgiveness, but an absolute impenetrable wall of severance and apathy. On days when the heavy rains fell, the flesh on her legs would throb and ache where the binding ropes had cut into her. Every time the pain flared, she remembered the blinding snowstorm and the flesh-tearing cold of that night in the forest, hardening her heart all over again. The taste of vengeance was not sweet. It was bitter and tasted faintly of iron. She realized with piercing clarity that the rest of her life would be spent silently enduring these unerasable scars, wearing them like a dark badge of honor. Wounds do not simply vanish, they only make us harder, or perhaps infinitely more lonely. Elise sat by the hearth fire, taking up her sewing needle. Every time the sharp point pierced the taut linen fabric, her gaze would drift toward the distant forest peaks. The wooden shutters rattled in the wind, but she no longer shivered in the cold. Snow melts and turns to water, but the earth that was once frozen solid remembers the bitter frost, even as it welcomes the spring. She had found her peace, but the days of her pure, innocent youth were gone forever, locked away in a past she could never return to. The cold chill of her tale would linger within her, a silent, quiet prayer for the soul she had forever lost to the winter snow.